It was the fall of 2016, my first semester at college and my first time living away from home. Me and my best friend Tommy moved into a dorm room on campus together. And life was great. We stayed up way too late every night eating microwavable food, playing video games, and partying with other students on our floor. Halloween had landed on a Monday that year, but that didn't stop us from throwing a wild rager. It wasn't a typical party. Everyone on the floor was in on it. Some people even decorated their rooms to be all spooky. You couldn't walk 5 feet without running into a cooler full of beers or a bottle of gin. Parties like this were not allowed, but we knew that we would get away with it on Halloween. I remember walking down the hallway with Tommy, going in and out of our friends' rooms. One room had Monster Mass blasting while they were playing drinking games, and another was lit with a black light as they attempted to hotbox the room with vape clouds. Whenever we had enough of one room, we just hopped over to the next. It was like the college kids' version of trick-or-treating. And after a few games of beer pong and way too many shots, I ended up crashing on somebody's beanbag. I don't know whose room I was in, but they had a cheesy horror movie playing on the TV and I got sucked into it. Eventually, I snapped back into reality when somebody kicked the beanbag. There you are! It was Sydney, the girl that I sat next to in photography. She lived a few levels up and I invited her to the party earlier that day, though nothing had been said out loud yet. And it was obvious that she had a thing for me. And to be honest, I liked her too. I'll never forget how she looked that night. Dirty blonde hair tied back into a ponytail, black framed glasses, and a t-shirt with a purple witch riding a broomstick, as well as a light gray denim jacket unbuttoned. You showed up. I was still laying down, bent backwards and looking at her upside down. How drunk are you right now? She crossed her arms and glared at me with a mock disapproval. I just grinned ear to ear and chuckled. She helped me to my feet, and I was hit with an intense wave of dizziness. And after a few minutes of regaining control of my body, we joined back up with Tommy and everyone else for more games. No more drinking for me, though. I was too far gone already. People were constantly coming in and out of our room, and I started to notice a trend in their conversations. They were all talking about room 1113. Dorm room 1113 belonged to a guy named Levi. He didn't have a roommate, and it was just him in there, and I never found out why. He was a weird one, the kind of guy to randomly derail a conversation into something completely unrelated, and sometimes really dark. None of us were very close with him, but it wasn't like we hated him or anything either. I will admit, though, if I knew that he was going to be somewhere, I made a point to avoid that place. Levi was hosting some sort of haunted house in his room that night. I just laughed and said, fuck that, when Sydney said that we should go and check it out. She looked at me with a sad expression on her face. But I love haunted houses, and you're not too scared, are you? She said with a sarcastic smirk. Of Levi Crawford? Yeah, I'm terrified. She laughed and we continued our game, but we kept hearing passing conversations about the crazy shit that was going down in Levi's room. I decided to ask Tommy if he knew anything about it, and he told us that Levi was charging $5 for a trip into his haunted closet. Haunted closet? Wait, are you for real? $5 to go stand in a rectangle? And I thought that he had to be joking. I haven't gone down to see it yet, but Chase was saying that it's fucking crazy, man. Like, I guess there's a whole other room connected or something, Tommy replied, and this piqued Sydney's interest. A secret room in his closet? Nate, we have to go see it. The closet in room 1113 was the last place on Earth that I wanted to be. But Sydney was so excited, so how could I say no? I pulled out my wallet to make sure that I actually had $5, and I did. She lit up with joy, and I rolled my eyes. All right, go see this creepy closet. Tommy, if I'm not back in 20 minutes, you better call the police. He laughed and agreed. We walked down the hallway to find a line of 5 people waiting outside the door that read 1113. I asked them if they had been through yet, but none of them had. And they all had stories from their friends, though. Each story was different and completely unbelievable. And I just chalked it up to inebriated exaggeration. There's no way that Levi Crawford was pulling off these Hollywood-level effects in his little homemade haunted house. Cindy interlocked her fingers with mine as we listened and gave my hand a squeeze. My heart leapt a bit, and this was the first time that we had ever held hands. I squeezed back, and all feelings of regret disappeared. I remembered thinking, hey, I guess this $5 isn't for nothing after all. The door opened, and a lanky dude with an afro came out. He didn't say a word, but he was visibly shaken, and his eyes were wide. Then he just slowly walked out the front door of the building. I don't know what he saw in there, but it must have been pretty bad. The two girls at the front of the line exchanged nervous glances with each other and then walked into the room, closing the door behind them. They were inside for about 10 minutes before the door opened again, and they came stumbling out into the hallway. One was crying, and the other had her arm around her friend, trying to console her. We were all concerned and asked what had happened. I don't know, replied the girl who wasn't crying. She got really scared by something, but I never saw it. She won't speak, and I don't know what to do. The next three people in front of us went in one at a time. The first was gone for about 10 minutes too, but he came out fine, and he actually laughed when he saw us. Pretty freaky shit in there. He chuckled and pointed his thumb back to the door behind him. Then it was Kate's turn, one of Tommy's many ex-girlfriends. She was gone for less than 5 minutes before the door swung open, unleashing an outburst of rage. What the fuck is wrong with you, Crawford? She looked absolutely pissed. How could you do something like that, you fucking freak? Levi peered around the corner. It's not real, Kate. I'm sorry. She was already storming away. What the hell happened? I asked Levi. Sometimes things just seem too realistic, that's all. It's nothing to worry about. And he gave a smile that was probably meant to reassure us, but it wasn't convincing. Nervously trying to move things along, he shifted his attention to the next in line. Colin, you're up next, buddy. Got the money? Actually, I just realized that I didn't bring my wallet. An obvious lie. Sorry, Crawford. He scurried away from the door, and then it was just me and Sydney. And Levi shifted his gaze to us. I guess that means it's our turn, Sydney said, bouncing up and down with nervous excitement. I wanted to follow in Colin's footsteps, but she grabbed my arm and led me into Levi's room. And once the door closed behind me, I found myself trapped in an atmosphere of the most pungent aroma of old takeout food and sweat. A wad of cash was sitting on his bed, surrounded by pizza boxes. He added my $5 bill to the pile and ushered us into the closet. I opened the door to reveal a super regular-looking closet. There are some coats hanging up, shoes on the ground, and no Halloween decorations. What do we do? I asked. Step inside and see what happens, Levi replied. And I looked at Sydney, and she stared back with a puzzled expression. I think that she was finally having regrets, but it was too late to back out. We stepped inside the musty closet, and Levi shut the door, engulfing us in darkness. And we stood in silence for half a minute, and I let out a sigh. Is this some sort of joke, Levi? No response from the other side of the door. Maybe it's a puzzle, like an escape room, Sydney said optimistically. I don't see how that could be possible. Tommy said that it was like a secret room, remember? Tommy likes to talk out of his ass. He hasn't even been in here. I couldn't see a damn thing, but I could hear and feel Sydney fumbling around in the dark. She shuffled to the back of the closet, blindly patting the wall. And then she let out a gasp. Holy shit, there's a door! And suddenly light poured into the closet. There was actually another room connected to Levi's. It looked just like a typical dorm room with the same colored walls, carpet, and light fixtures, but it was completely unfurnished. There was nothing in the room at all. This is so weird. Whose room is this anyway? Sydney asked. I don't know. I guess nobody's using it for the semester. Why the hell are the closets connected? That seems like a privacy issue. Maybe that's why it's not being used. As we paced around the empty room, I was expecting a jump scare or something, but nothing happened. I realized that I couldn't hear the music playing from the hallway anymore, which was really odd. I made my way to the front door and I placed my fingers on the handle and I hesitated. It hit me that this was the obvious path to take. Certainly Levi had something set up on the other side of the door to scare anybody who opened it. I lowered my hand, and I looked through the peephole first. Complete darkness. That bastard taped the peephole. What do you think Crawford put on the other side of this thing, Sid? And I turned around and I noticed that she was staring out the window. She didn't seem to hear me. Her full attention was fixed on something outside. And I went over to her. Hey, are you all right? And then I saw what she was looking at. Out in the field, something was staring back at us. It was dark and the shape was hard to make out, but I could tell that it was tall. Its eyes were glowing white, its head looked deformed. We kept on staring at it, expecting it to move or something, but it didn't. It's a pretty good prop. Wonder how he made that thing. Where the hell are we, Nate? Her voice was shaky. What do you mean? This isn't our campus. My blood went cold. She was right. Why didn't I notice? This window should be facing the courtyard outside, and the other buildings should be visible. All we could see was an open field. I think I'm too drunk for this, Sid. Let's go back. And she nodded, but kept her eyes glued to the figure outside. I grabbed her hand this time, and she jumped a little, but it broke her trance, and she finally looked at me. Her eyes were filled with genuine fear, and it was so quiet that I could have sworn that I could hear her heart racing. Or maybe it was mine. We made our way back into the closet and began rummaging our way through Levi's things. My hand brushed up and down the smooth, textureless wall of the back of the closet, and my stomach dropped. Oh, fuck. Oh, fuck, 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 fuck! And then I became frantic, feeling all over the wall that should have been the door. The handle was gone. I dropped to the floor, searching for the gap that should have been there, but my hand slid straight to the carpet. What is this? She asked, but she had already figured it out before I could say anything. My fist slammed on the wall in desperation, but nothing happened. We yelled so loud our ears hurt, but nobody heard, and after a while we just stood there in silence. Sydney broke it when she began to cry, and I instinctively wrapped my arms around her and pulled her in close. Hey, it's gonna be okay. It's just a trick, right? We can figure this out, like an escape room, remember? And I felt her head shake up and down gently against my chest, and her shoulders began to relax. We came back into the empty dorm room, and I glanced down at the window again. And the figure was gone. Sydney noticed it too, and we looked at each other but didn't say anything. I began scanning the room for any sort of clue on what we should be doing, but I couldn't find a single thing. I think that we need to try the front door. She sounded like she was trying not to cry again. I gave her a slow nod. I was dreading having to open it even more now that that thing outside was gone. And I checked the peephole again. But it was still dark. I placed my hand around the doorknob and began to gently turn, quietly as possible. I felt the subtle click in my palm and slowly cracked the door open. I peeked through the sliver of space and gasped. I expected to see a hallway, but the door led straight outside. And I opened it to get a better view, revealing an empty field. Just like we had been seeing through the window. No lights, no buildings, no cars, nothing in sight, nothing at all except tall grass. Sydney pushed past me and stepped out of the door, frantically looking around. She started hyperventilating, and I think that she was about to have a panic attack. I tried to tell her to come back, but it was like she couldn't hear me. I started yelling, and still no acknowledgement. She was just wandering out too far, and I was getting scared. And finally, I stepped out of the door, walking up to her and placing a hand on her shoulder. She flinched hard and spun around, and when she looked at me, her eyes went wide and her face drained of all color. And then she let out an ear-splitting scream. So loud, my hands reflexively sprang up to my ears to cover them. She shot off in a dead sprint, and I turned around expecting something to be behind me, but there wasn't. Was she scared of me? When I turned back to see that she was fading out of sight, I ran after her screaming, "Sid! Sid, come back, please!" I chased after her for a few minutes, but it was so dark and I couldn't see anything. The only light source was coming from the dorm room that was still left wide open, and I completely lost sight of her. Scared and confused, I ran back to the door and noticed that it was just a door. I could see into the room, but there was no building on the outside. It just stood there like a portal between worlds. I rushed in, fearing that it would suddenly close at the last second and trapping me in the field, but it didn't. And I stood in the empty room, trying to gather my thoughts. I hated myself for losing Sydney, but she had to come back, right? There was nowhere else to go. She had to come back. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something pressed up against the glass window on the other side of the room. And when I turned my head, it scurried out of sight. I could tell that it wasn't the figure form before. It was smaller and shaped differently. And then I remembered that the door was still open. I quickly darted over to it and began to slam it shut. I could hear a rustling and the grass growing closer. I locked the door, and almost immediately the handle started violently shaking. I screamed and I fell to the ground, filled with terror. There was a muffled, angry moan from the other side. Whatever was out there was starting to pound on the door so hard that I thought for sure that it would break right off the hinges. I scrambled back to the closet and I shut it. I made myself as small as I could, cowering in the corner, and then began to sob uncontrollably. After a long time, the noises calmed down. But I didn't dare move. I don't know how long I sat there, curled up on the floor. I think I must have lost consciousness at some point because I remember the feeling of waking up. I was in the same position, but my muscles felt stiff, like I hadn't moved for several hours. There were shadows moving under the door now, and the feeling of dread washed over me again as I remembered the situation that I was still apparently trapped in. I stood up and I made my way to the closet door. I pressed my ear up against the wood and I jumped when I was met with 3 gentle knocks from the other side. "Who's there?" No reply. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to be polite and open the door, and so I did. And the thing on the other side was dressed in rags. Its gray skin was shriveled and its head was bald. It was like staring at a rotten fruit, but in human form. And it stepped into the room, which looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was flaking, the ceiling was cracked, and the window was dirty. You couldn't see through it at all. The gray creature bowed its head to me, like it was giving thanks, and then entered the closet that I just exited. And when the door closed, I noticed that there were several more of them waiting in a line. They were all wearing similar clothing. Old, stained cloth, poorly sewn together into a makeshift cloak. And none of them looked at me. They all kept their heads down and seemed to be shivering. I think that they were in pain. The way that they clutched themselves shakily, the small raspy noises that came from them as they exhaled, it reminded me of being sick with the flu. At first I was scared, but then I felt pity. Not knowing what to do, I went to the front door again and I looked through the peephole. And to my surprise, the hallway was on the other side. I ripped the door open to discover that the rest of the building was the same condition as the doorroom. I stepped out and I peered both ways down the hall and then faced the room again. The gray, wrinkly things weren't shivering anymore. They stood up straight now, revealing how deceptively tall that they were. Before, they wouldn't even look in my direction, and now they were all silently making direct eye contact with me. It made me feel uneasy, and I bowed my head slowly like the first one did to me. And then I closed the door on them. I'm not sure if that was the right move to do, but they were creeping me out. They didn't seem to be making any objections to me leaving. But either way, I sprinted to the front of the entrance of the building and flung the doors open only to be met with more disappointment. It was morning now, and all I could see in every direction was an endless expanse of grassy fields. And I stared into the emptiness for a while, calling out Sydney's name and hoping that maybe she would hear me. I knew that I wouldn't get a response, though. I turned around and began to take in the dormitory complex that used to be a really nice building. And now it looked like it had been rotting for decades. And I decided to go back inside. Maybe those gray things could help me somehow. I didn't want to face them again, especially after how they were looking at me when I left, but I didn't know what else to do. And then I realized that I didn't actually know what door that was. If it was connected to Levi's, I guess that would make it 1114. I started making my way back into the direction that I came from when I heard movement. And then I froze in place. It sounded like someone was rummaging through something metallic. And slowly I tiptoed to the corner and peeked around it. The thing that was pressed up against the window last night at the end of the hallway attempted to get into the vending machines. I got a much better look at it this time. And the image will be forever burned into my brain. It had human skin and human limbs, but way too many of them. The way that it crawled around was spider-like. Some of its arms were tiny and frail, while others were freakishly long and muscular. Its mouth and eyes were too big for how small and bald its head was, and the whole body was covered with dark bruises. I got the feeling that it wasn't always like this. Some sort of terrible mutation experiment gone wrong, maybe? I don't know, but it was horrible to look at. And it didn't seem to notice me. And so I slowly crept towards room 1114. I got all the way down the hallway and made it to the door without making a sound. I was a lot closer to the creature now, but it was completely preoccupied with the vending machine still. And gently I began to twist the doorknob. But it wouldn't turn. I tried harder and it still wouldn't budge. It locked me out. I whispered to myself. And that was a big mistake. The creature heard me even though I spoke so quietly. Its head jerked in my direction, and suddenly I was staring into its deep black eyes. And neither of us moved for a second. And then it lunged forward, a dozen bony limbs scrambling into action, propelling the creature towards me at an unreal speed. I sprinted down the opposite way of the hall, and it let out a deep, hateful moan as it pursued me. It was gaining on me, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to outrun it. I had to think of something fast. I don't think that I could successfully fight it, so the only other option was to hide. My own dorm room was coming up, and I made the split-second decision to try it. Thank God the door was unlocked, and I slammed it behind me as fast as I could, and I locked it. The creature was enraged and threw a tantrum just like it had done the night before. I sat on my bed, which was covered in a thick layer of dust now, and waited for the freakish thing to leave. And eventually it did. And that's when I heard something new. Coming from my own closet was the sound of radio chatter. I got up and I quickly went to the back. And I cried tears of relief when I found another door. And without wasting a second, I opened it and stepped through. 3 cops were staring at me like I was a ghost. I was back in Levi's room. The investigators were dumbfounded. They had already searched the closet and everything else in Levi's room, and here I was, appearing out of it like fucking Houdini 6 hours later. They rechecked the closet after I had returned, but the door at the end was gone again. Me and Levi were brought to the police station for questioning. I told them everything, and it must have sounded batshit crazy. But I wasn't the only one. All of the other students that went into the closet had already given their accounts. And for a long time, Levi and I were primary suspects in the Sydney Baker missing persons case. But they didn't have anything to go off of, and eventually it was all dropped. They even demolished the entire building, probably expecting to find her corpse in the walls or something, but nothing turned up. Now the only way of getting her back is destroyed. And every night I'm haunted by the thought of her being trapped in that hellscape. I have tried reaching out to Sydney's family, but they don't want anything to do with me. They blame me for her disappearance and probably think that I killed her. And I can't even be upset with them. It's the most logical explanation. I ended up dropping out of school and moving halfway across the country to distance myself from the trauma. My therapist suggests that I should write this story down. She thinks that it will help me seek some sort of closure, but here we are at the end, and I still feel as lost as ever. I haven't given up on Sydney, and I don't think that I ever will. I spend all of my free time searching the internet for ways to get back to her. I've read hundreds of stories from people claiming to discover gateways that lead to other worlds, but none of them seem legit or similar to my experience. None of them, except one. I've been messaging a guy named Chuck who claims to have found a place that shouldn't exist. He described it as infinite farmlands as far as the eye can see. It's the most promising lead that I've had yet. And I'm meeting up with Chuck next week. He strictly told me not to tell anybody about where this place is or how to access it, and I swore that I wouldn't. And I know it sounds sketchy, but there's seriously something about this guy. I think I believe him. Anyway, wish me luck.
Bend over, grab the desk, and grit your teeth.
Talk about your subplot.
And what will you be advertising?
GoDaddy.com.
Batman Forever on pay-per-view. See it again.
I don't know what changed. Kim was normal when we met, when we got together. She was for months. A whole year, and now... Hold on, I need a quick shower. I watched as she stepped into the bathroom of our apartment, the shower turning on for the third time that day. She was in when I woke up. She had another after lunch, and here we are again before we go to dinner. And despite that, I swear the whole place smells like roadkill. I don't stop her, though. Even when her constant showers don't seem to be helping whatever that smell is. I've looked all over the apartment. I've showered extra, but nothing seems to be the source. Is it the bed? I wandered back into our room, thinking about it for a while as I waited for Kim to get ready. Our sheets were clean. I washed them pretty often anyway. They weren't stained, and Kim hadn't said anything about the bed, let alone the smell to begin with, even denying when I brought it up. I've considered that I might be going insane until I spotted something in the sheets. A worm? It looked like there was a worm sticking out of Kim's pillowcase. My brow furrowed as I lifted up the pillow to check it, watching it fall out and hit the bed. My face contorted in disgust. It was dirty, as I guess worms always are. I grabbed a tissue and I picked it up, going and loosely tossing it out the window since I wasn't sure what to do with it. Go decompose something that actually decomposes. The shower turned off in the hall, so I tried to brush the thought off and went to meet her. Kim stepped back out of the bathroom after a few more minutes, grabbing a scarf and wrapping it around her neck, giving me a chuckle. It's only in the 60s. You're really that cold? She gave me a bemused sort of look. Sorry, we can't all be little snowbirds. Come on, we've got a reservation. You can't pull that Californian card when it's barely below room temperature outside. I nudged her playfully as we left the apartment, heading downstairs and out into my car. It almost felt like my elbow went into hers, sinking into her skin even so slightly, but I wouldn't be able to tell under her sleeve. Too bad, pulling the California card. She hopped into the passenger seat, subtly massaging where I'd elbowed her. And again, still, I brushed it all off, thinking that I was imagining things and blowing them out of proportion. A molehill is only a mountain if you're looking at it from an ant's point of view. And speaking of ants, I had to fight between the prospect that the restaurant was frequently and suddenly had an ant problem, or that the ants were following Kim. They stayed away from my side of the table, but they crawled all over hers, across her hand and through her food, burrowing into it and her very pores before me. She got up constantly for the bathroom, something about how her diet was messing with her bladder. But I noticed what it really was. I could see the ants. I could see them swarming her at every step. They floated and drowned in her glass of water. Her hands came back more scrubbed raw every time. They were red and almost shrunken looking. Wrinkled at the ends, her manicured nails looked longer than I swore they were yesterday. And when Kim stepped away for the 8th or so time, I leaned over across the table to investigate the pasta. She'd been eating hungrily the whole time, so not very much was left. And still ants pooled all over the plate. The surviving ones devoured its remains, and my face scrunched up with disgust. She was quick to return, though, so I played it off and hoped that she didn't notice. Kim moved over the table to give me a kiss when we stood up to leave. Her breath felt like it had been festering for months, vile and chilly, even under the scent of pasta. She tasted like spoiled meat in Alfredo sauce. I think she noticed the way that I recoiled, no matter how much I tried to cover it up. She gave me another little look. What? I don't think that the pasta smelled that bad. And I forced a smile. Just stronger than I expected. Kim shrugged, taking my hand and leading me back to the car once I tipped. I pursed my lips as I looked at the end of her blonde hair. I felt something in my mouth. With my free hand, I reached up, opened my mouth, and pulled it out. Something hard and jagged. Half of a tooth. I felt sick. My tongue ran over my own teeth just to be sure that I hadn't bit one out without noticing. But no. There was nothing. Nothing hurt in my mouth except for the hard shard that had poked my cheek. There was no way that it was mine. I looked back at Kim as we reached the car, flicking the broken tooth away as my stomach churned, trying to ignore the growing suspicion that something was wrong with her. She turned and smiled at me all the same, hopping in the passenger seat and strapping in. Maybe I was just going insane. I went back to writing it off for the rest of the night. Like an idiot. She didn't want to kiss me goodnight, probably after earlier. Not that I really wanted to taste that again anyway. And things were only getting worse though. I woke up hearing the shower running, and I flipped over, checking this time thinking my alarm was about to go off, but it was 4 a.m. I could hear Kim fumbling around in the bathroom. Turning back to her side of the bed, I glanced over the sheet and pillow. It was hard to tell in the dark, but I swore that it looked grimy. Still, I closed my eyes again, lulling myself with the pitter-patter of the shower. At least, I tried to, eventually having to scoot myself away from her side because of the smell. Still, it wasn't enough to knock me out before she came back, wrapping her arms around me from behind and resting her forehead against my shoulder. Rancid, cold breath sent a shiver down my spine, but I just kept trying to sleep through it. It was only getting harder to do, though. She was cold, unnatural, and the smell was growing unbearable. And worse than any of that, I could feel something wriggling its way underneath me. Countless little maggots worming against my skin, writhing and nibbling and eating away at me. Slowly, all with such deliberate bites you would think that they held personal grudges. But I was scared. Terrified, really. That if I were to move, I would make it real. It wouldn't be a dream if I addressed it. So I just had to pretend that it wasn't there. 3 agonizing hours went by before it slowed to a stop. The parasites retreating to where they came from just in time for my alarm to go off. And finally able to get up, I left Kib whining about the cold and went straight for the bathroom. My skin was reddened. My lower back itched, clearly covered in little flecks of gnawing when I could get a good look. I exhaled the shaky breath, getting into the shower and scrubbing it with soap and lotion, shutting my eyes and praying that it would go away if I just kept ignoring it. It must be something more explainable. What the fuck kind of answer was there for this? I let Kim into the bathroom so I could get dressed. The shower turned on again, of course, and I could hear her practically chugging mouthwash beyond the door, feeling as if that might even taste more worse than what it felt like last night. I got ready for work quickly and left breakfast on the table for her before I headed out. I couldn't stop itching. I had to hold it together. It was utterly unbearable. I'm still so surprised that no one called me out on how many times I went to the bathroom that day to itch and reapply what little lotion I had left. Scrubbing my own hands red, staring down at them, making sure that they didn't look shrunken. They were fine. It was stupid to be checking. Disgust crawled across me all day. I was swatting at more flies than I could count through every hour. And so I scrubbed more, dabbing on more cologne. And they swarmed me regardless. I was running out of reasons to deny that something was up. On the drive home, I considered my options, how I could possibly approach the question. I had to. The other choice was starting to look like I was letting myself be eaten alive by insects. I loved Kim, but I don't think enough to be devoured by bugs until I was a skeleton. And when I got home, I had my points in mind. gearing myself up to talk to her. Opening the door to meet me was the same repulsive scent, but it was mixed with something far nicer. Steak. There you are. Kim jumped me at the door, grabbing me by the collar to loosen my tie. I made dinner. Go get into something comfy so we can eat. I have a surprise for you. And so, like a fucking moron, I pulled it off. I changed and I sat and I had a wonderful meal with my girlfriend. And at least the steak was good. The bugs festering in our apartment haven't demolished her cooking skills. Still, the fact that it was a possibility that was entering my head meant that I needed to focus. Hey, Kim? Yeah? She looked up from the sink, cleaning up the dishes from dinner. I wanted to ask you something. I haven't been sure how to, I admitted, glancing away from her and off towards our room. Even without looking her way, I could hear her whole face light up in her voice. Oh, I have been too. Actually, give me a second. I opened my mouth to cut her off, but she was already running up towards our room with soap still in her hands, slamming the door shut in her wake. Okay, I'm holding off again. And I sat and I waited, hearing the door lock click open after a few seconds. And Kim didn't come out. Why don't you come in? She called out, a tone I recognized. I got up, steeling myself. If it was supposed to be a distraction, I couldn't let myself fall for it, no matter how alluring she tried to sound. And after a few steps, I opened the door. Kim was laying on the bed, wearing a lacy black nightgown. Her feet dangled off the bed, letting my eyes trail up her legs to the hem of her short dress. I snapped my eyes away and back to her face. Of course there was that look. I tried not to let it get to me. I really need to talk to you about this, Kim. We have all the time in the world, she replied softly, sitting up and reaching out to pull me over by my shirt. I stumbled slightly, starting to feel almost dazed and blindsided. She wouldn't touch my skin. She knew her flesh was cold and thin. I could see it on her. Her face looked sunken in the dim light of the bedroom. Something crawled out of her tear duct. An ant. My eyes widened, but if she noticed, she couldn't care less. Kim yanked me down on the bed, forcing me to loom over top of her, hands down on either side of her neatly crossed legs. She unfolded them and leaned back again, staring at me expectantly and nudging my thigh with her toe. I felt so ill. My hands almost moved on its own, resting on her side, slinking down to lift her nightgown. But as I did, I froze up, horrified at what I should have been expecting since I got home. Insects squirm in and out of her stomach, of everything below. Maggots worm in and out, spilling down her body, feasting. I gagged on the smell, the revolting stench of rot, staring in disbelief at the fungus growing out of her rotting meat. She lifts a thinning hand, placing it on my cheek, another maggot wriggling its way out from beneath her fingernail. I felt like I couldn't move. Only shaking breaths kept me alive. How it felt my heart had stopped with the rest of me. Fruit flies buzzed around her naked flesh, gorging in pure delight of the meal that she had blessed them with. With my other hand, she took my own, moving it towards the festering mess. It's okay, she cooed. I should warn you that they bite, but the pain doesn't last. It feels wonderful. I promise. I tried to open my mouth, but my body wouldn't let me. Kim's hand cradled my face as she spoke, continuing to guide my hand through the infestation that her body had become. They like how you taste. Do you want to deprive them of that? Deprive me of that? I could barely get my lips to part. Darling. Yes? She insisted, thumb grazing them. But I still couldn't find a word to say. Kim just smiled at me, bringing my hand lower. That's okay. I promise it'll all be worth it. What we take from nature We had to give back, don't you think? And when my skin made contact with a spider crawling out from inside of her, my body finally allowed me to react. I wrenched myself away, gasping for clean air, covering my mouth with my clean hand for a moment before I made a run for it. I heard her call out, trying to scramble after me, but I didn't look back. I ran for the door with all I had, barely taking the seconds to grab my keys and wallet, hurrying out to my car. When I made it out there, she was right on my heels. One of my coats hastily draped around her to hide what was oozing from her flesh. I fumbled with my keys and I got into my car just as she reached out and grabbed the door frame to stop me. Her hand was in the way. I slammed it shut. She barely even flinched when the door sliced her fingers in half. I shivered as I looked down at the severed ends, but she was starting to climb on top of the hood of the car. I didn't have time to get repulsed. I started the car and I floored it out of the complex, letting her roll off the front when I lurched backwards. I managed to find a motel for the night. I turned my location off. But I'm worried that she has another way to find me. Or worse, the infestation has already begun within me. Flies buzz around my head even after my fourth shower of the night. My skin itches. My hands feel almost completely unusable. That smell has followed me here. I can tell. I'm terrified to go to the doctor, but I guess that's my next order of business. But I'm going to make this public first, for fear that Kim finds me before I can be admitted somewhere. It's too impossible to endure. I don't know how long she's been like this. Maybe I've been being eaten for weeks. Maybe I'm already going to rot.